Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
You can see the pressures, right? You can see the potential for a working class party that would absolutely blow things up and for good and ill in different ways. But it's not there yet. And for all the talk, like, you know, our friends, NatCon and everything else, what that would look like, what that would entail is promising. There's some interesting things happening there, but we're nowhere close to having that full blown. And then let me throw the curveball. And then in the meantime, there's real potential for one man like Donald Trump to show up and just screw everything, all of this analysis up as people gravitate towards some figure who pronounces himself savior.
I'd just like to point out for those who are not watching the live feed here, because we don't offer that functionality right now. That was not producer Jake hitting the one man button on his console. That was actually Matt Peterson himself. Who has hidden talents, which we are now discovering.
Hello and welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast from the American Mind. I'm your host, Spencer Clavin, features editor of the American Mind and associate editor at the Claremont Review of Books. I was away for 1 week and you guys threw a party without me. Last time I was away, Seth picked up the slack by doing a solo pod. This time he again picked up the slack, but invited all of our buddies, and I'm extremely annoyed that I missed it. You guys had Raboy, you had Anton. It was sounded like a really good time. Anyway, I'm back. Glad to be back from abroad and looking forward to another conversation. We are joined this week by a motley crew, a very exciting list of guests. I am joined by managing editor of the American Mind, Seth Barron, editor James Poulos, and now for an exciting edition, we have both co-founder of New Founding, Matthew Peterson, and contributing editor of the American Mind, Helen Roy. Let me just jump right into it. We wanted to spend basically all our time today looking from a couple different angles at this New York Times poll that was released in advance of midterms. Obviously, New York Times Siena putting out a bunch of data on likely voters for November. Now, polls, of course, we are no poll extremists here on TAM. We're not poll truthers. Generally, these things, have a wide margin of error, tend to often be based on faulty assumptions and so forth, and indeed don't always even ask the right questions. So we're not trying to read the tea leaves here or look into, what's November going to deliver, so much as we are trying to take some of these longer trends, which this poll seems to confirm, as jumping off points for talking about what's going on in the American electorate, how realignment is shaping up, and what we can sort of think about right now in terms of, the way people are feeling in this rather turbulent time under, it turns out, a rather unpopular president. So let's give a couple top line items here. The big takeaway is, I guess, that whatever sort of summer surge the Democrats were having, whatever mileage they were getting out of Dobbs and fear-mongering over, the end of abortion, whatever they were getting out of that, they have now lost. The economy has rocketed right back up to the top of the list when it comes to things people care about. Among likely voters, 49% plan to vote Republican on November 8th versus 45% that plan to vote Democrat. That's not a favorable margin. It sounds like a 4-point margin, although the Times notes it's closer in its unrounded form to a 3-point margin. Nevertheless, we had another bad inflation report last week. People are obviously feeling this, as we've discussed now many times. They feel it directly. They experience it in the day-to-day. They feel the pinch. They feel the suffering of this. And this is simply the most significant item on people's list. It has jumped. Those who say that economic concerns are the most important issues has jumped since July. It was 36% in July, 44% now, and that's way higher than anything else. That's just what people are thinking about, even and including if they're concerned, if they're pro-abortion and they're concerned about the overturn of Roe, which has been the major trump card for Democrats. They're going to take they're taking your constitutional rights away, and so on and so forth. The Times quotes one woman who agrees with this view, who says she disagrees 1,000% with Dobbs v. Jackson, and nevertheless just cares more about not being able to pay for stuff, which seems pretty reasonable to me. So that's kind of the big headline out of this. But there's a lot of stuff also, which is kind of more structural, having to do with demographics. One of them that we wanted to start with is women, as they say online, WAMMIN. That's women who are, in general, Republicans are gaining independent voters, which is really crucial. They've got a 10 percentage point lead among independent voters. And when it comes to women, we're at an even split, 47 to 47% when it comes to Republicans and Democrats. But women who identify as independent have started leaning more Republican, according to this poll. In September, we had a 14-point lead for Democrats among independent women. Now we have an 18-point lead for Republicans among independent women, which is just a radical shift, and one that I think speaks volumes. I'm going to start, actually, I think, by handing this over just directly to Helen. Helen, since you're here, since you often write for us on women's issues, this poll shows that women retain an unfavorable view of Donald Trump at 46%. That was something I found kind of interesting that people haven't been talking about as much, is that this change is not, it's sort of Trump independent. It has to do, I think, with bigger issues. And I thought I would ask you first and foremost, what you think some of those issues are that are driving this shift.
That's a great question. I will happily take it as the token woman here. So,
yes, our resident woman. Yes, well done. Off you go. Much more than that, of course, but please. Yeah.
So, what we can hope, actually, I think, is that women are feeling existentially pinched, even if not outwardly or even consciously aware of it. I think that, there's the material, very practical fact that women as household managers are probably stressing over getting groceries now. I mean, I know that I am. Like, it's pretty absurd how, and I do believe that the inflation is being underreported in so many areas, but especially groceries. But I think, when I talk about feeling like existentially pinched, whether they want to admit it or not, two things have really picked up in the past couple of years, especially since 2020, a pretty clear anti-white bias. If you have white children and you've been mothering these children and seeing what's been happening in schools since the summer of George Floyd, I think even if you're posting the black square on Instagram, you are privately fearful that your kid is going to get beat up in the school bathroom and nobody's going to stand up for him. And then secondly, the transgender movement poses an existential threat to women in a lot of ways, and, women's children. So I think that Chris Rufo has done that, really the important vanguard reporting on both of these, on the critical race theory and the effects of that, the real life effects of that in schools. And now the gender craziness, and just how far these movements are really going and violating sexual boundaries between strange adults and children. I think that, like I said before, even if a lot of these sort of women are publicly signaling one thing by posting the Instagram infographics or whatever, they privately fear another. And that it's a primordial fear to have somebody to that kind of threat, that somebody would hurt your child in any way. And so what I think and what I hope is that that's kind of what's happening here.
Yeah, I really like that phrase, existentially pinched, because obviously, as you say, women, like everybody else, but maybe especially as household managers, are encountering the economic stuff. But there are, really primal and serious threats, that the Democrat Party poses to children, especially also to, I think, women, a special hostility, as you and others have written about for the site, a special hostility toward womanhood and the womanly nature. I'm going to open this up now to everybody else and just ask, what do you guys think about many of these issues? It would seem have been sort of percolating and bubbling for a while. The trans stuff certainly has really been like a frog in a pot. Why is it that we're that it's taken so long? Is it just a matter of the Chris Rufos of the world having to come along and make people see it, or has it reached? Have we reached something, some sort of more systemic crisis point that has forced people in general and women especially, it seems, to confront some of these issues?
There's so much ferment going on right now, and I think your question is interesting. I agree with the trend. I do, in fact, think that it takes a long time for people to internalize and ruminate a little bit. I mean, in the midst of their lives, about where things are going and how bad they are. And it certainly is the case that this feeling of unrest has covered the entire country and seeped in all these places. And what happens in the election seems to me it's not about the Republican Party, which sucks. It's about striking back, or is trying to say no, remembering what they did to you, or realizing, gosh, we just need something else, so I can't do the same thing. And there's no way to slice this without looking at the numbers or what's going on, without Republicans having massive wins. But the more interesting question, the problem is this solidifying in people's minds? And I think it is. I think it's important to realize the very basic point I want to make, which is that this stuff takes a while. And if you're listening to this podcast, in a sense, you already are elite. You're paying attention. You're interested in this kind of stuff. You're interested in hearing us blather. And, you're not normal. And for regular people to start to realize it's this bad when so much is against them seeing it, so much propaganda every day, 24/7, continuous flow, more and more digital, surroundings that's brainwashing them or hiding the truth. And then when you don't want to see it because out of denial, it takes a while. And I don't want to sound like I'm, sanguine about this and it's all going to turn out and the pendulum's going to swing. But I do think we haven't even seen the beginning of resistance, horror, the kind of crazy reaction that gets unpredictable when people really start to grasp what's going on. I have a close relative called me today talking about leaving a job related to the military and just basically describing his, complete, like he knew it was bad, but he had to see it from different angles. And he's basically saying, it's not about a recruitment problem. It's who they're recruiting, and they're keeping psychopaths and terrible people. And you could just hear the tremor in his voice when he started realizing this whole thing is corrupt. And so, that's something that takes a long time, and it doesn't necessarily mean things go in the right way. So I do think, though, that this election it'll be neatly packaged by everyone as a red wave, but it will reveal the unrest in a specific way. And the Republicans aren't going to be able to grab that and package it well. That'll be a messy process that, if it ever happens, will take even more time. But certainly you will see that. You'll see that manifested. And you already see it now with numbers that, frankly, no one wants to say because they don't want to sound like some normie con, but the numbers are crazy. I mean, the numbers are crazy red. And a lot of that is people who are just kind of like, I need to try something different. What the hell's going on? And you can kind of get a sense of, as all that seeps over the country, that can lead to panic, that can lead to all kinds of interesting things that are positive. We'll find out, but we're still going over this waterfall.
Maybe it would be helpful to address that question of the packaging, right? That this will be claimed, certainly, if present trends continue, if things go the way they look like they're going to go, it'll be easy to see this from a kind of normie perspective as Biden sucks and we're having our usual sort of pushback, first midterms of a presidency, all sorts of governing narratives that are very familiar, that this sort of stuff could be like incorporated into. Do you think that will fly? I mean, is there a sense in which that is in some ways kind of pacifying, right? To think, yeah, well, this is the normal trajectory of democratic politics and everything is just kind of going back to to normal, or do you guys suspect that, as they say, an election won't fix this?
Well, it's not going to hurt. People do want to hear a voice outside their own head saying the things that they hear inside their heads. And in a situation like this one, where the Nano-State is now being replaced by the Nano-State, which is penetrating down to the molecular level inside our bodies, if there's no way to register a coherent opposition to the penetration of a very activist and very highly opinionated regime down to the molecular level, then our form of government is not going to be operative. And so I think, despite the craziness surrounding Trump's potential future and Biden's potential future and the potential future of the three other agencies, possibility of a more formally declared world war than the one that we seem to be, evolving into. There is a baseline headed into this election, and the baseline is, do you support the Nano-State in this House? Do you believe that it is the essence of the just regime to penetrate down to the layer of life that this regime is not just penetrating, but is using in order to establish a new sort of governance and to legitimize that form of governance in the minds of enough people so that it can kind of wave around this critical mass and use it to justify its techniques? I think that we will see in November where the center of gravity is politically on that question. I think that question is already out in the open, but it's going to become more out in the open as we hurtle on towards 2024. And I think you'll start to see this conflict become even more explicit. You've got Stacey Abrams up there saying, like, well, if you just have an abortion, then you won't have to worry about high gas prices. You've got activists out there now pushing the envelope of the multi-striped flag brigade to the level of trans is sacred. There's your new hashtag. No sooner do we get protect trans kids and all that means underneath the shiny surface. But it's now clear that the sexual politics of the regime are being cast in explicitly religious terms. The CDC has just voted, its governing body or whatever it's called, to recommend formally that the full suite of COVID vaccines be administered to very young children. This is a kind of biopolitics that is without precedent in human history. It is just getting started, and it will continue. Apple, just to pull more seemingly random news headlines from the swarm out there, Apple looks poised to enter into the health insurance industry by partnering with some major consolidated health corporation and basically funneling in all of the data that it accumulates every day down to the molecular level from the Apple Watch. So it's easy to see that all of these things are combining because they're all interoperable. They are all technologically enabled or made possible by technology in a way that unites them into a single type of governance, a single type of regime. That's what's on the line. People are increasingly recognizing this. They will say so openly. And if we can't sort that out through our form of government as it currently exists, then it is only reasonable to expect significant changes.
Yeah, I agree with what everybody's said. It does seem as though the Democrats, for the last few months, they've been very sanguine about their prospects of, winning seats in the Senate and, holding the House, or maybe just minimizing their losses in the House. Their desperation is starting to bleed through. I mean, it's fascinating to me that in Georgia, the Warnock-Walker race, the needle just has not budged. It's clear that it's like a dead heat. They've gone after Walker. And I mean, let's just be frank, he's not like an ideal candidate. Like, if the Democrats had a normal president, it would be very difficult, I think, to unseat the incumbent, who at least can like answer questions in kind of like a normal way. In Pennsylvania, you're seeing a similar type of thing. I mean, there they have like a very deficient candidate, but Oz has his own problems. It's weird. I mean, there's some very strange things taking shape. I know it sounds like a crazy long shot, but okay, in Rhode Island, there's this Chinese American Republican, Alan Fung, who was the mayor of Cranston, the two-term mayor of Cranston. He is running against Ira Magaziner's son, Seth Magaziner, who's the state treasurer of Rhode Island. Ira Magaziner, for those who may not remember, was like a major Clinton fixer, and he was the brains behind Hillary Care back in like 1993, 94. So, this is like a major inside player. But here's the thing. Rhode Island is like basically the bluest state or among them. But Fung is up in these polls, the Chinese American Republican, Catholic, pro-life, like Trump hat wearing. I mean, moderate Trump. He's probably not ultra MAGA. He's just like semi MAGA. But the Democrats are freaking out. They are pouring tons of money into a Rhode Island congressional race. I mean, this includes Providence. If Providence is in play, things are afoot. In New York, where I live, Kathy Hochul, who, took over when Andrew Cuomo was ousted, she is running a terrible race. I mean, she's a terrible candidate. And, her opponent is nothing special, a Long Island congressman, Lee Zeldin, but he's within shooting distance. I mean, the polls are tightening and he's in single digits. The Attorney General of New York, Tish James, whose entire term in office has just been like going after Trump, which is what she swore she would do, just inventing, reasons to try to prosecute him. She's apparently behind in the polls, which is bizarre in New York State. So there's clearly things happening. I mean, all of the excitement is clearly on the red side. This woman, Carrie Lake in Arizona, is just a dynamo. I mean, she's astounding. I mean, I expect if she wins that race, I mean, she's going to be like on everybody's short list for like the 2024 ticket. I don't know. I mean, look, if things were normal, I would, one would assume that the Republicans would sweep. But, look, if elections are still fair, then the Republicans should win a lot. But who knows? Who knows what they've done? Who knows what's happening inside the machine? So, I guess we'll see.
Yeah, Seth, what you're saying, and also what Helen said earlier, does seem to me to indicate one thing, at least, really is coming home. And that is, we've been talking basically since we started this podcast about how many of the Democrats, or let's say the left's signal issues, are really confected, just smoke and mirrors designed to distract from people's real lives, from their everyday concerns, from their actual experience, from their common sense, right? Like, your racism is in the very DNA of this country, and white people are inherently racist, and it's impossible for brown people to be racist. I mean, these deep, passionate, really signal items of Democrat rhetoric, which bear no relationship to your average person's experience. I mean, you ask somebody, is that your experience of life? And people who say these things, who will actually, mouth the words that America is systemically racist and, white people are inherently evil. Like, they'll say things, appalling and atrocious things. And you say, well, do you mean, are your white friends like that? Have you experienced the world in that way? And and everything is kind of on this level, right? These abstractions, these euphemisms designed to point people's eyes away from what they know to be true, which is that a baby is a human person, and then to just introduce these more and more insane and abstruse and kind of anti-human ideas into the political bloodstream. And maybe the economy, which we've just been asking again and again, like when is this going to become apparent to people that these things don't actually, they're getting more and more distanced from real life. And maybe the economy just, in some sense is the representative of that. It's reality coming home. This woman who says like, I'm so incensed about the end of abortion rights, but like, runaway inflation is kind of moving me more. People demonstrate, it's an ancient observation that people demonstrate their true priorities and their true beliefs with their actions long before they admit to them in words. And I hope that, in fact, what we're seeing here, in part at least, is just the unsustainability at last of continuing to confect a sort of imagined set of problems and an imagined set of villains and heroes and triumphs and failures and battles. Just the impossibility of living in that world and placating and mollifying yourself with that world for long, when in fact the real concerns of the kind that James is indicating are bearing down upon us harder and more pressingly every day. In that vein, let me now turn to another aspect of these results, which is, we've had for a while some signs of racial realignment in the polls, and these are reflected and deepened in these latest results. We've got 34% of Latinos likely to vote Republican, and that's up from 32% who voted for Trump in 2020 and 29% in 2016. So now just a clear trend there. And then Black voters, obviously generally kind of locked in for the Democrats, but we've got 18% of Black voters intending to vote Republican. That's compared to 8% who voted for Trump in 2016 and 12% in 2020. So again, as they say online, number go up, and number go up consistently and repeatedly and in ways that don't look like passing fancies. If Democrats lost, Black support in any meaningful way, it would be an utter disaster for them long term. But, I didn't want to just introduce those numbers without contextualizing them into what I believe might be a more substantive kind of shift, reflective of people's real concerns and so-called identities, because it's easy, I think, when you're up against a left that is increasingly racially essentialist. It's easy to slip into racial essentialism on the other end, to say, well, Republicans need Black votes, or they need Hispanic votes, or they need whatever. But that's our argument, as I understand it, is not that at all, but rather that there is no such thing as a Black vote or a Hispanic vote, right? These are not actually ultimately, finalizing categories that speak to the heart and the soul of God-created human being. There are much bigger questions on the table, and that is also reflected in these numbers, which show a serious kind of class dividing line. And I've said for a while, in areas like college admissions, that even if you want to accept the argument that there are, as they say, historical injustices which still have ongoing effects, race is an extremely blunt tool for getting at them. And really what you're doing is you're raising issues of class, which do obtain and are very much on the table ever since Trump. Trump really was, I think, in some ways, a sifter for a new form of class politics in the 21st century. And that's only gotten more stark with this. I'm reading here from the New York Times, Mr. Biden's base of support is increasingly shrinking to urban, well-educated enclaves with Black voters, city dwellers, and those with at least a bachelor's degree among the few demographic groups where a plurality of likely voters think he is doing well. Among likely Hispanic voters, a narrow 46% plurality disapproved of Mr. Biden. Even as 60% said they would vote for congressional Democrats this fall. And so on and so forth. But then they go on. College was a particularly strong dividing line among those with a bachelor's degree. Democrats held a 13-point advantage. Among those without one, Republicans held a 15-point edge. It used to be the kind of line, the easy gesture to make here for Democrats was, well, of course, educated people support us because they're smart and informed and they know what's going on. They understand, they're not easily swayed by political rhetoric. And it just gets less and less easy to make that connection between a bachelor's degree and smarts, or connection to reality, or immunity to political grandstanding and political tribalism. And increasingly, it seems to me that the opposite is true. And so I wanted to raise that also with you guys. Are we seeing the sort of crystallization of a new kind of class politics? And should we be glad about that, or concerned? I mean, should we be encouraging people to kind of align themselves with the populist motion, or are we worried about that kind of old political philosophical concern that class strife, class tension, class warfare is one of the most dangerous things you can have in a republic?
Well, it's funny on this Times Siena poll. One of the questions I like the most: does the government mainly work to benefit ordinary people, or does the government mainly work to benefit powerful elites? And there's some interesting stuff in there among the different races. Curiously enough, Hispanics believe that 72% of Hispanics believe that the government mainly works to benefit powerful elites. 68% of whites believe that the government mainly works to benefit powerful elites, and only 64% of Black respondents believe that, which is kind of interesting. So Black respondents are more likely to think that the government works to benefit ordinary people. I don't know what you can derive from that, but it does seem as though there is this pretty broad consensus that the government mainly works to benefit powerful elites. But it appears that white college-educated people are twice as likely to believe that the government works to benefit ordinary people than white non-college-educated people. So, yeah, I mean, there is this weird... It's funny to think that college education maybe teaches you to... I mean, it really is kind of a form of indoctrination, I guess, into thinking that the system is working. The system works. I don't know. It's a really good question. I'm not sure how we're going to realign things along populist lines, and if that would even how that would even work. I mean, the idea that the Republicans are actually going to become the kind of some sort of New Deal social democratic party just seems a little unlikely to me. But I mean, I guess there are tendencies.
Let me just say something quick. I mean, I think in your discussion of class, I have the same question Seth does. It is destructive. Part of me wants to say, Spencer, we're already there. This already is class warfare. It's been class warfare for a long time, and yada yada. Just lean into it. But I think what's missing from the discussion and what prevents that kind of neat and tidy analysis is that from Aristotle on, some brilliant observations about regimes, what prevents this is a middle class, right? I mean, so the destruction of the middle class is a trope in American political and cultural life. It's something we always worry about. But there certainly is something to the middle class. Either a lot of people did move up, like the AEI types, right? They'll be like, well, the middle class, in part is squeezed because a lot of people moved up. And to some extent, that's true. You have an upper middle class or an aspiring middle class that really wants to please the overlords, and they're going to put the Biden and Beto sign and the black square. They're going to do everything they can. They're going to jump in as high as their masters want. They see that they're very, very angry and they have to move in this direction, right? A lot of those people are not changeable, but they're worried about what's happening. So you do have a middle class, and then you have people, of course, who just can't get ahead, and it's being ripped apart from both sides. Like the gravity of the elite and the gravity of not being able to make it is pulling the middle class apart, and that's your source of stability which prevented Republicans from from being sort of the New Deal party post World War II. And so I think that's at stake. I don't think it's like all one way or all the other, but it's clearly being ripped apart. And in the midst of that, you have this general breakdown of trust and the corruption. My favorite statistics, I say it every time, no one listens, no one says anything about it. I mean, since 2015, this study has shown the most widely shared fear in America above everything else, death of a loved one, COVID, whatever disease, nuclear war, whatever it is the fear of the corruption of government officials. So that's third world country territory. And that's been going on since 2015 at least. And so, so that dynamic is there as well. And in the midst of this, you do see realignment. And what I would say just very briefly about that is there certainly is a lot of evidence, it's real, that among Hispanics, you're really seeing a shift. It's among a certain, kind of Hispanic, more working class, middle class, people who are rooted in some way. But there's a lot of those people, obviously, who are Americans, and they're moving in a different direction. With Black voters, it's mainly right now about turnout. No one's excited. I mean, no one's excited. No one's, people aren't going to show up, and you can see the pressures, right? You can see the potential for a working class party that would absolutely blow things up, and for good and ill in different ways. But it's not there yet. And for all the talk, like, our friends, Nat Khan and everything else, what that would look like, what that would entail is promising. There's some interesting things happening there, but we're nowhere close to having that full blown. And then let me throw the curveball. And then in the meantime, there's real potential for one man like Donald Trump to show up and just screw everything, all of this analysis up as people gravitate towards some figure who pronounces himself savior.
I'd just like to point out for those who are not watching the live feed here, because we don't offer that functionality right now. That was not producer Jake hitting the one man button on his console. That was actually Matt Peterson himself, who has hidden talents, which we are now discovering. I'm just going to read a tweet in response to this question. I think that's fair game, since I sent the tweet during this podcast. So it's all one content stream, people. It's just the same uninterrupted feed.
Is this, I'm sorry, there was once, James, going to be a segment on the American Mind called AIRT, as I recently tweeted. Are you proposing that we resurrect AIRT?
Yes, it is. It has been resurrected. It's not up to me. It's up to the bots. So just to go back to the Apple in the healthcare industry thing, I found this piece of news via Mike Davis, who you can find on Twitter, former chief counsel for nominations on the Senate Judiciary Committee. And he in turn linked to, of all things, a Forbes article where, some industry analyst was being quoted at length about how and why Apple would be moving into this sector, into this industry. And the quotes are just so illustrative of not just the return of a certain kind of class politics or class warfare by other means, but a transformation, a technological transformation of how the classes are divided, what it means to be in an upper or lower or middle class these days. And the first quote from this guy, I will protect his name so as to shield him from humiliation, was, "I don't think it was a Trojan horse to get into this. I just think it's been a natural evolution. All of a sudden, they look at the data that they've got and they say, should we go into the healthcare industry?" And then he goes on, "Healthcare is a deep societal thing that Apple would like to fix." Really cosmic brain stuff here. And I think, not to totally extrapolate out of what one guy said, but I think it is representative, and it does speak to what's going on below the surface here. Is, it used to be that being ruled by the smartest people meant that they would intervene in more and more ways into your life because they have all these ideas, and ideas are everything. And so the more ideas you can have and the more smart people you have, the more of a division of labor there is, and people really drill down. And, it's like being stuck in a political science department where all the grad students are writing their dissertations on a footnote in some volume of John Rawls or another. But no longer. Being ruled by the smartest people nowadays means basically being ruled by the people who take orders directly from the swarm of bots. They mainline the data tells them what to do, they do it, they tell other people what to do based on what the data swarm is telling them. And then as you sort of trickle your way down the chain, the number of degrees of separation of sort of human middle managers or gatekeepers that are separating you from the main line of the data swarm determines, how far down on the pecking order you are. And of course, it's only a matter of time before those human middle managers are themselves replaced with robots, whether it's a robot on the phone line or probably very soon a robot in the big box store, a robot at your job, sort of looking over your cubicle, whether literally or figuratively. And I think, this is the new class system that is emerging.
The way that I think about this and like maybe the proper distinction when it comes to like, oh, is it class? Is it race? Like, what's the proper friend enemy distinction here? I think that really you can just kind of look at who's being rewarded. And there are, the left has two different but united in the fact that they're being rewarded client populations. That's you could say it's the very poor and the very rich, but there are other ways to describe this. It's like the imported poor. It's like the third world being brought in intentionally to disrupt our sort of the demographics of this country, and then additionally an elite that isn't just rich, but it's a particular kind of elite that is sort of, as James has suggested, ideologically and practically aligned with like a transhumanist agenda and other sort of creepy things like that. So that's sort of how I tend to think about these things, not necessarily on like a classical class spectrum, and nor really on like the black and white traditional American race spectrum either, but a secret third thing.
That's a really good point, Helen, in my humble opinion. And maybe it can be sort of yoked a bit to some of what Matt was saying. I was just in Athens for a little bit, and the one feature of that was I had occasion to reflect upon the archaic history of Greece, which is to say, before democracy emerged in Athens, before the Persians invaded, before all the big names that we know about, like Socrates and Aeschylus and so forth, were mucking about. And one thing that really struck me was remembering that during this period, which was a period of enormous economic inequality, sort of the central feature that every city of life that every city-state was trying to resolve through some sort of constitutional change, was famine and economic inequality, and therefore debt slavery, right? The hectameroi selling themselves and their children into debt slavery. And in that time, as Athens was sort of looking around itself at the other city-states, one of the major facts was that, populism of a certain sort and tyranny were in no ways enemies. In fact, they were very closely yoked as bedfellows. The idea that the people would sort of clamor for land redistribution, and then some very charismatic and aristocratic leader would promise to give it to them and to eat the rich, so to speak. That was what was going on in Megara, in Corinth, in Sicyon, and any number of other places. And it was in contradistinction to that you have what eventually emerges as Cleisthenic Athens, where, as Matt is pointing out, the big difference here is the middle class, is the availability, or the, first of all, the intervention of Solon, who famously kind of hammers out a compromise between these two sides of society. But then over time, the development of people, a fair number of people, citizens in Athens with a decent amount, small but decent amount of land to farm. And so, Helen, in some ways, what you're describing is uniquely American and very new. In others, it's quite ancient, right? The alliance between power-hungry elites and those who are in one way or another, extra citizens and or dispossessed. That's an incredibly kind of primitive and primal way of organizing society. And if the Republican Party or the right is going to offer an alternative to it, it has to have to do with the kind of citizen middle class. I mean, we've talked about the kulaks too before a lot on this podcast, who were threatening to the Soviet regime for precisely this reason. Here's my question for you guys. Is the Republican Party capable of becoming, over time, let's say, the representative? I mean, I know, Matt, as you say, it's very far off. We're certainly far away from that, from having a political voice for that kind of movement. Is the Republican Party capable of morphing into that political voice, or is it ultimately going to require reshuffling to the extent of a new party altogether?
It's funny. Noam Chomsky, who I quote a lot, I feel like, on this podcast, but he made a kind of a funny observation once about our political system. He said, this is a familiar thing you hear from the left, that basically, we don't have a workers' party. We just have like two business parties, right? Like both parties are the parties of business. But he said the difference is that, okay, the Democrats are the party of big business and the Republicans are the party of big business and small business. So and that's where the kulaks come in. Like the kulaks are basically like your small businessmen, like your small proprietors, I don't know, people who run who build pools or have contracting business or own like a small factory somewhere, like your wealthy peasants, essentially. They don't necessarily have a college degree, but they have enough money to have a really nice house and, a fleet of, Ford F-150s or whatever. And, buy cars for their kids, go on vacation, all the things that the liberal elite resents them for. So, I think that, I guess I think fondly, and that's sort of what I think of as kind of old style Main Street republicanism, is that in the old days that was who they represented, like the people who own businesses on the main streets of America, farmers, small proprietors, professionals. And that was really the focus. Maybe this is basically a fantasy. I get that. But, and, are those people necessarily aligned with the people that they make loans to and sell insurance policies to, and, whose sewers they dig or whatever? I don't know. But it is nice to think that at least the Republicans do have this tradition of representing small business as well as big business. And maybe that's something they can return to. I don't know. I mean, of course, this is all coming from Chomsky, who's like a hard leftist. So, maybe it doesn't really have any significance.
I think it's interesting too, again, chiming in as a woman, that that children have become such a focal point in so many ways, and such a, how would you describe this? It's just, everything from the trans issue in schools to just basically who is willing and happy to reproduce and concerned about, American vitality, ourselves and our posterity as sort of the engine of prosperity. It's interesting to me too. And of course the abortion issue, how a lot of these divisions converge on questions of, what is a child? What do you think a child is? Who do children belong to? For what reason?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the way, Helen, that people talk now about loud kids on planes, which if you really boil it down, sort of sounds like they think just nobody should ever reproduce. And if they do, they should keep their children locked up in a little box, in a soundproof box until
Oh,
they
yeah.
reach the age of majority. Yeah, I mean that is, and it's at the heart, I think, of more than just the explicitly child-centric issues that you mentioned. It's also at the heart of something like environmental apocalypticism, which views the human race as effectively a parasite upon the earth, you know, a cancer, a net negative. And so if you think that, of course you're going to think, you know, that like more people is a net negative, because like you don't have an underlying premise that actually like people are the point. Do you know what I mean? Like in some ways your answer to the questions about children is really your answer to the question, like, are people the point, or is something else, some other God besides the one that loves people the point?
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great point. You know what? And I think about this too, like people, or the way that I've sort of seen it said, and I think it's a good rhetorical comeback to these things, is like really wanting a child-free life is like 2 steps away from wanting a child-free world. And so when you respond to people like this, I think it might be a good way to frame this, to say like, okay, you're entitled to a child-free life, but you are not entitled to a child-free world. Like,
yeah.
I'm glad you bring this up. I mean, I was just thinking, we were talking like there's different ways to divide things up and talk about realignment. And I was thinking of it even in broader terms as human versus transhuman, you know, or whatever the other thing is,
or anti-human,
anti-human, demonic, satanic. But this notion that we need to preserve the human person. I mean, there's all these old words. We were a couple people, including one on this podcast, we're talking about human dignity, for instance. It doesn't quite capture what's needed now. It all seems kind of weak, but certainly in the background is this looming question of, you know, what does it mean to be human? And on one side, you think a certain way about childbirth, abortion, and end of life, beginning of life, and that's real. That is a real. You can't escape the culture war, right? I mean, that was the thing. Let's talk about economics. Let's talk about class. In some ways, let's try to hide some things about class, and let's stay away from these dirty, you know, social issues, or whatever you want to call them. It's like you're not going to be able to ignore this. So what you think human beings are is it hasn't gone away, and in fact, it's come back with a vengeance when you look at what's going on. So I don't think that is fully gestated yet. No pun intended. I think we're still sorting this out. People are still grappling with this enormous divide about what men and women are, et cetera. So, you know, that's in the background though, for real. And it becomes real when you go to school and, you know, they're trying to trans your kids, and it's not a joke and it's not an exaggeration.
Yeah. I was just thinking about, this is in my book a little bit, that like the idea that there's all these calls now to, you know, share child rearing. And it's interesting to me, you know, which is kind of a commune, you know, abolish the family and let's have the village and so forth. And it is interesting how often those elide really seamlessly into, you know, childlessness, which is another kind of ancient sort of Aristotelian point. He talks about the republic and sharing wives and children in common. And he says that's like when you dilute a little bit of wine into a lot of water, you lose the taste. Or when you dilute a little bit of love among a lot of people, you lose the passion and the intensity. And so many of these kind of generalizing or globalizing ideas often seem to me to be just like going gently into that good night, right? Like share the children, share the wealth, share everything, so that nobody has any kind of personal attachment or responsibility to the future, to what have you. Well, this was really interesting conversation, you guys. I feel like I am going to go away and think a lot about some of the things you have said, especially this last segment about, you know, where is the real divide. I hope our listeners feel the same way, and we will pick up again next week.
Can I show one thing?
You please do.
I should say, because I just put it out on Twitter also when we were on this cast, I like the way James excused that too. It's just it's one stream, it's one feed.
We can come clean.
It sounds so good when he said it. I'm going to borrow that. I developed that line of thought. I'm just a feed spilling out all kinds of stuff, man.
Some people just say that that's all humans are. It's just chance streams of information, although I don't think that's quite the route you'd like to take.
Well, this stream, I'd forgotten about this really until today. There was a chance meeting between myself, Dave Raboy, Martyr Maid, our friend Daryl Cooper, and our friend Charles Haywood, Worthy House, and Michael Anton, all in the same room. And I just got this idea, like, let's just talk about Caesarism after having too many drinks. And we'll see if it works out. But we are going to release this as part of the Matthew Peterson show. And so if you subscribe, newfounding.podbean.com or Apple or Spotify, you should at least check it out. And I think listeners of The American Mind will find it amusing or interesting at least.
Excellent. Yes, thank you. I promised, Matt, that I was intending to plug your show, but now I'm glad we have a concrete episode to talk about.
I mean, I give up. I'm at this point, I'm plugging my podcast. I may as well live in Austin.
All right. And with that, I will give you the standard plugs plus a few extra goodies. Thank you for listening to The Roundtable. If you want to learn more, visit our websites at americanmind.org, claremont.org, claremontreviewofbooks.com, and our DC-based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. You can donate to support the show at claremont.org/donate. You can find Matt at newfounding.com, and you can find the Matthew Peterson podcast wherever you get your podcasts. That episode he just mentioned, plus trenchant insight into our current political condition and much more. Helen writes regularly for The American Mind, so you can find her there. She also has a podcast. Helen, you want to plug your podcast real quick?
Sure. My podcast is called Girl Boss Interrupted, and you can find it wherever you get your podcasts. It's about womanhood in the modern world and the sort of open air insane asylum that women are currently occupying, driven to the end of their wits by sexual licentiousness and careerism, and how those things are deeply related.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, it's a must listen, I have to say. Always great guests, interesting people, and crucial topic as well. The rest of us are just the regular old schlubs. You can find us where you usually find us. Don't forget to rate, review, share, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. 5-star reviews are especially helpful. Next best thing is to keep it to yourself if you have a negative opinion. Thanks, everyone. Talk to you next week.